Welcome back. In this episode, we're doing a once-over of how to choose components for load development. But there are so many powders and bullets to choose from. How do we navigate through the countless choice combinations available? We start by making as detailed a list as is possible, describing our ideal end state. Write that list down if need be, so you can easily refer to it as you progress through this process. Choosing primers. What primer is best to use? What are top shelf primers? And why do we use them exclusively? Types of primers, naming conventions, application considerations. Basically, pick one brand and stick with it. And brass. Are all brass created equal? What's the best brass to use? Why would we pay more for brass? What about bullets? What kind of bullet should you choose, and from which manufacturer? Will you really get better results if you spend more money? And finally, powder. How do you choose a powder that will give good results? Should you shoot that same load the forum dude shoots? How can you be sure that powder is going to be the best choice? Let's begin by asking, what does success look like? Are you hunting? Doing long-range precision work? Competition? Are you plinking? These uses may be very different from a reloading perspective. And while we talk here, let's focus on hunting so as to keep this conversation on a single track. The questions will be the same for other use cases, but the answers will vary significantly. Number 1. For an ethical kill, the slug has to hit the vitals and rapidly dump enough energy to guarantee a one-shot kill with higher than 80% probability at distances beyond the maximum range we consider ethical. This builds in forgiveness and ensures we have enough oomph when the moment comes. Number 2. Bullet trajectories must be flat enough so we don't need a competition turret to hit our target at our longest ethical range. Number 3. Bullet composition must lend itself to both accuracy and controlled expansion in large game. This is non-negotiable. The bullets must be proven to perform at and beyond our maximum ethical kill range. Number 4. All components, the brass, bullets, primers, and powder, need to be readily available and affordable so we can practice with our platforms to maintain proficiency. And number 5. The successful cartridge and load will provide stable performance across temperatures ranging from sub-zero through 80 degrees or more. And that pretty much sums up our winning load. Now, to choose components to get us there. About primers. Use only top-shelf primers. This absolutely critical component is never to be taken for granted. CCI, Winchester, and Remington are the only brands we stock. We've never had an issue with any primer from these manufacturers. We have seen problems with Fiocchi, Gen X, and the other bottom shelf stuff. There's a new primer manufacturer in town these days, and we haven't seen enough information or use cases to develop a meaningful judgment about them. Until we do, we urge people to stick with top-shelf primers. For precision, long-range, or hunting use, pick a brand and type and stay with that. Always evaluate new lot numbers in your loadings, because loads can change performance when primers change. For our hunting loads, we use Winchester. Not that Remington or CCI are bad in any way, but rather because we have decades of empirical experience, which proves to our satisfaction that even in sub-zero conditions, our first shot will perform just like it did on the range. Flawless is the reason. The other brands are good too, but we know Winchester primers work for us. For our precision and long-range stuff, we primarily use CCI. We have found CCI offers low dispersion at greater distances, even with their standard grade primers. BR4 are good, but expensive, and we don't see that much improvement over the standard rifle CCI primers. When buying primers, note the lot number and stock up on that lot. It sucks to pull a new brick, only to find now you're switching lot numbers, and you need to do a short ladder before throwing them into service. If at all possible, buy your components in bulk. We buy a barrel's worth of primers, powder, and slugs, so everything that barrel sees is from the same load workup its entire life. We try to do this for all of our important weapons. For our range AR-15s, we throw whatever's cheap and available. Now on to brass. For precision loads, we use Lapua. We've tested Hornady, Winchester, Starline, Lapua, and others, only to find Lapua outperforms all of the others in every category we can test. Not only do they last longer, case volumes and dimensions are more consistent right out of the box. ES and SD and resulting group sizes are better across the entire lifespan of the brass, and they're easier to work with. During annealing, they more consistently accept heat than other brands. Sizing and seating have a far better feel, producing far less variation in both operations. They're not as pressure sensitive either. Hornady brass often fails in our 6.5 Creedmoor carbine after 4 or 5 loadings. Primer pockets get loose, the case heads start bulging, and this is a sub-max load. With Lapua, we routinely get 12 to 15 loads before any signs of fatigue present. In our 308 carbine, Lapua does not suffer from case head swiping, while Hornady suffers badly. Sometimes it just pays to buy the best. For our hunting and defensive rifles and pistols, we use either Lapua or Starline. Lapua in our defensive carbines and hunting rifles, and Starline in pistols loaded heavy for bear country. For general range use, we really don't care about brand. When they fail, they fail. They go to the recycler. Most of our 223, 45, 9mm and such are range pickup brass, so we're not expecting much out of them, and we don't cry when we throw them away. And on to bullets. Think about your intended use and be honest with yourself. Do you really need that $1 a bullet burger, or will Hornady at half the price meet your needs with room to spare? Have you tested terminal performance? Maybe you should. Choose your slug to match the job. Hunting dense woods and mountains where shots might range no more than 400 yards? Choose mid-weight slugs that offer flatter trajectories and provide excellent terminal energies at your longest ethical anticipated distance. If you're hunting the open plains, it might benefit you to look at heavy for class slugs to take advantage of both the greater mass and higher ballistic coefficients. Heavier bullets buck wind better and retain their ability to penetrate at greater distances than lighter bullets. They also offer higher BCs, which makes heavier bullets fly more efficiently. That's a win-win. Varmint hunting usually calls for a very flat-shooting cartridge like the 22-250 or 243 Winchester. Lighter slugs will be devastating on small targets because the bullet will break apart on impact, shedding all that energy in a fraction of a second. Also, this reduces the chance of ricochets being a problem. The bullets frange when they hit something. We can buy ballistic gelatin and shoot that stuff ourselves, see with our own eyes, and make informed decisions that fulfill our needs for facts rather than the manufacturer's need for a marketing strategy. Furthermore, we feel that it's owed to our target animals. They didn't choose to get hunted, we chose to kill them. It is vital we do so in the most humane way possible. There are no excuses. You must test these things for yourself. The good news is, Hornady makes fine hunting and target bullets. So does Winchester, Remington, Weatherby, yes, even Berger. They all make fine bullets. You get to choose which one is best for your application and your particular rifle. And finally, powder. What do we look for in a powder? Well, we need it to behave predictably from low to high temperatures. It needs to burn cleanly, fill the case 90 to 102%, and provide adequate velocity while keeping pressures in tolerance. Sometimes, low flash signature is also a factor to consider. All manufacturers have their own take on the modern temperature-stable list of powders. Hodgdon markets the Extreme line of powders. Winchester sells the Stayball line. IMR has Enduron, while Vidvori advertises some of their powders are the, quote, most temperature-stable in their class, end quote. For what it's worth, our experience with Vidvori indicates their powders are excellent, but they display characteristic double-based burn issues. We prefer the burn rate modified ball powders like Stayball 6.5 and HD for volume work, and short stick stuff like Vargat H4350 and H1000 for critical long-range work. H4350 is a modern marvel. Now, powders are described by their burn characteristics. Every loading manual has a relative list of powder burn rates, and such a list is only useful from a reloading standpoint when conceptualizing what powders might do well with a lighter or heavier slug in the same caliber. No matter what people might tell you, it's simply not safe to presume adjacent powder names on that list can be used indiscriminately. Use only published data from manufacturers of that powder, or the bullet you're using. Never exceed published max loads. Even though things can look okay, they are in fact often very dangerous. So how do we guess what powder to use? Well, hang in there. We'll get to that in just a moment. The science of projectiles in firearms is defined as ballistics, and it can be divided into three distinct categories: internal, external, and terminal. From the perspective of the reloader, we're most often talking about internal ballistics. For all that is known about internal ballistics, there is more that is inferred or outright empirically expressed as probabilities. But there's still a ton we don't know, truly know with a capital K. It's an incredibly dynamic and sensitive process, and we may never truly nail down what's going on in the chamber. For our conceptual needs, it's enough that we're able to make meaningful changes to our load choices and safely perform tests to validate those effects. Before we get to the meat of it, let's do a short dive into the list of things that affect load accuracy by magnitude, from large to small. The largest magnitude choice will be powder selection. This is the first and largest lever we can pull to affect accuracy in our hand loads. The second largest magnitude is bullet selection. How the bullet interacts in our barrel when propelled by our powder is the second biggest lever we can pull. Quality of brass and preparation for reloading is nearly a religious thing for some folks, and indeed, it comes in as the third largest lever we can pull to affect our success. The consistency of our crimp or neck tension. How the bullet is held, or more precisely, released from the neck, is a huge thing when trying to shrink group size. Treat your brass right, and it'll do better for you. It's our fourth largest lever. Consistent seating depth, or the distance to the lance, is our fifth lever. We're getting into small magnitude effects now, but seating depth can change the shape and size of your group. We'll talk more about seating depth in our next video, load development methods. And the choice of reloading dies. Your dies need to be matched to your bullet and process. Does that mean we need big money dies? Hardly. In fact, unless you're spending all your time in competitions, you can load perfectly acceptable ammo with standard grade dies and shoot well past 1,000 yards. Choosing dies is a tiny lever compared to the other things we've already mentioned. This quick list is just an approximation to illustrate the need to apply a mental value to what most affects my reloads. You'll notice that things like a $1,500 press didn't even make the list, because the magnitude of that impact is severely overshadowed by the choice of powder, the weight of powder charge, its consistency, and then how your bullet and barrel get along. The greatest magnitude choice we can make for accuracy is finding a powder well matched to our velocity and our bullet barrel combination. This is a huge concept to get your head around, and is absolutely essential to understanding the forces your bullet will be subject to during the course of being fired. If you conceptualize the entire internal ballistics event from the perspective of your bullet, you'll be on the right mental path to making ever better choices of what's needed to be tweaked in order to improve your reloading and ultimately increase your hit percentages. And it's time now to narrow down the list of powders to 2 or 3 so we can keep from blowing money and time out the end of our barrels. Let's presume you know what cartridge you'll be working with. And let's presume you've settled on a projectile. You've chosen a primer, a top shelf primer, and you will stick with that brand and lot number. You've committed to using top shelf brass, and you'll work with that same brass throughout your entire load development process. These presumptions set the stage for us to begin making one change at a time and documenting the effects of that particular change. It's science. Change only one variable at a time, or you pollute your data and ruin further testing. And let's push that deep into your consciousness. Change only one variable at a time. Begin your search for a powder by opening your reloading manual and looking for a powder that will give a small increase in velocity over a fairly large change in charge weight. Your mileage may vary, But we have found the best loads often exist just below published maxed velocities, so pay particular attention to that range. Load 5-round test batches using charge weights below probable ideal, including ideal, and on up to max load weight. Start shooting with the bottom of your charge ladder, progressing up charge weights until you either A, see signs of pressure, or B, reach the top of the charge listed in the book. Do not exceed published load data. Inspect each case as you fire it, looking for signs of pressure. Flattened primers, case head deformation and stamping, extractor marks, any cratering around the firing pin. How does the bolt lift? It should be smooth and easy, never sticky or hard to lift. Any sign of pressure, and it's time to stop shooting that load no matter where you are on the ladder. We've seen pressure signs halfway through the published data and didn't even get close to max loads before we stopped. Every rifle is different. Pay attention to how yours handles this particular powder and bullet. To get an idea of how a powder might perform for us, we first do a quick calc to find velocity change per 0.1 grain of powder. Not that it's scientific, but rather because it's a good indication of what we expect the powder to do as we increase the charge weight. It's a loose approximation of expectations. Remember, your velocities will almost always vary from that in the book. For this exercise, let's use published data from Hodgdon for the 6.5 PRC using a 143 grain ELDX bullet. Using this chart from Hodgdon, we can deduce a few nifty things before we even spend a dime. Let's do that quick calc. Time for some simple maths. We want feet per tenth of powder. Divide the spread of velocity by the spread of powder and multiply that by 0.1 to get feet per 0.1 grain. The first line is for US 869. It has a minimum of 61.2 grains of powder, resulting in 2643 feet per second, and a maximum of 68, which is compressed, and a velocity of 2982. That gives us a spread of 339 feet and 6.8 charge. You do the math on that when it comes out to 4.985 feet per 0.1 grain of powder. That's a little more sensitive than we want. It's going to be very sensitive to charge variation. We'd like to ignore that because we want a powder that's forgiving of charge variation. Also, it's important to note that US 869 is designed for 50 BMG and massively heavy slugs. Probably not a good fit for the 143 grain slug. IMR 8133, the second line, starts with a 53.6 grain minimum charge at 2637 to a maximum of 61 grains compressed at 2958. That gives us a 321 foot per second spread and a 7.4 charge weight spread, resulting in a 4.338 feet per tenth of grain of powder. That's actually fairly good. That makes a decent choice for us. However, we haven't seen it on the shelf, so we're forced to ignore that for now. We'll do the same calc for grand, and it nets us out at 4.58 feet per second. That's a little better. That's getting better. Still our last choice. It's fairly sensitive. We also haven't seen this powder on the shelf, so we're going to ignore it as well. If we can't get it, we're not going to load it. Moving on to Stayball HD. That nets out at 4.44 feet per second. Now this is getting better. Anything less than about 4.5. That's a decent choice. We already have that powder on the shelf for a different caliber, and since we have it on hand, this is going to get tested. Rotumbo comes in at 3.69 feet per tenth of grain of powder. That's very insensitive to charge variations. We already have this powder as well. Since we have it on hand, we'll load this too. IMR 7977 comes at 3.97 feet per tenth of a grain. This is pretty insensitive. It's a good choice. We haven't seen it on the shelf, so we're going to ignore it for now. And finally, H1000 comes in at 2.99 feet per tenth of a grain of powder. That's outstanding. That's the least sensitive to charge variation. That's a good first choice. We also have this on the shelf for another caliber, so we are definitely going to test this powder. So take note. We drive to an acceptable load as directly as possible. It doesn't have to be the load of all loads, but it must meet our requirements. Once we have a workable load, We can contrast that load against others as time goes by, maybe changing to a different load at a later date, but for now, we're looking for a load that meets our criterion that we listed at the beginning of this video. So we've narrowed down our search to 3 likely powders that will afford a relatively large variation in charge weight, resulting in a relatively small change of velocity. That is very desirable. That's how we keep our ES and SDs low. We keep our dispersion at long range to a minimum. Since we already have those powders on hand, it's a no-brainer. We're going to test them in our new cartridge. We've managed to exclude more than half of the powders listed before we even spent a dime. Okay, so it's not just a theoretical model and problem here. We actually did work up a 6.5 PRC load doing exactly what we described above. Results? The rifle in question loves shooting Stayball HD under that 143 ELDX. Groups are less than 0.7 MOA. ES is in the double digits, SDs are in the singles. Gel block testing at 400 yards proves there is ample performance remaining, suggesting 800 plus yards might be possible, even if not particularly ethical. So if you follow the thought process outlined in this video, you are going to find a combination that will probably make you happy. Or maybe you have a problem with your rifle. We've seen bad things come from Savage and others to the order of 6 and 9 MOA using factory match ammo. There is no way you're going to make that work, regardless of how well you hand load. You might need to upgrade your barrel. And now you have a good idea of how to choose your components. In our next video, Load Development Methods, we'll take a good look at how to apply these choices that we made today and get to the heart of real-world reloading. Thanks for watching.
That's just